So, I guess before I talk about this game proper, I have to talk a bit about myself. It's not something I really want to do, it's not something I like to do, mainly because, first off, I don't think I'm particularly interesting, but second of all, I don't see it as having that much of a point in an analytical piece or an opinion piece, something like this, whatever you want to define it as. It's actually the exact same reason why I refuse to just walk in front of a camera and talk to you in a review, despite the fact everyone else does it. I don't see that as adding anything. In fact, I see that more as a distraction from the actual subject and point. But this time I kind of have to, or else I feel like the footage may seem a bit misrepresentative of the game itself, and I want to take responsibility for that, but I kind of need to explain why this is going to happen. Now, if you want to skip all this, that's totally fine. I'll put up a chapter saying no worries. But this is going to be very, very personal for me, so this might go a little long. It might be a bit rambly. I apologize in advance for that. But as a kid, growing up, and into my adulthood, as developmental stuff happens, I had a lot of neurological developmental problems. I've never been properly diagnosed, so I'm not going to throw out any official medical terms or anything. My parents never saw fit to have me properly diagnosed by a doctor, and getting a proper diagnosis now is actually something I intend to do myself, but it's a bit hard right now. But without throwing out proper medical terms, I can tell you some different things I've experienced, because at least in my case, my developmental stuff was like a series of smaller stuff coalescing into a bigger thing. Fun story, but one big major part of it that isn't relevant to this particular video, but the channel as a whole, is before I did this, I don't know how many people know this about me, but I was a mute. I just could not talk. And I had gone my entire life without doing so. When I was born, even before I could walk, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to make video games. So even before I could walk, I started dissecting how mechanics worked. I tried to figure out flagging systems. I tried to figure out how complex mechanics interact with one another. And when I was 7, I finally started properly, using a computer to properly make games. Flash forward about 15 years, and I'm 22, a flood hits my hometown. And while my house was fine, I lived in a basement at the time. I had to move all my computers and everything just for safety, and in doing so, through random happenstance, literally everything I had ever worked on was just destroyed. Just gone. All the backups, everything. And, well, I can't begin to properly put into words how devastating it is to basically have everything your entire life has been worked up to taken away from you. It left me in a very, very dark place. One of my lowest points in life, probably my lowest point in life. And I kind of had two options. I could either curl up into a depressed ball and wait till I die, or I could try and still have my dreams through a 1 in a million chance, sort of, by sharing my biggest passion with you on the internet this way. I wasn't necessarily making games because I didn't have the resources anymore, but I could at least share the one thing in this world that makes me happy with all of you. Except I didn't talk, so I had to literally teach myself how to do that, and force myself to, and train myself to do that. If you look at my original video, which I want to say is about 7.5 minutes long, that is originally like a 6 to 8 hour recording of me iterating and reiterating and reiterating every single thing I said, just to make sure that I did it properly. And, even now, I'm still incredibly stressed out just trying to talk. Every time I stream, every time I record anything, it's very stressful for me. Every time I put a video live, I have a mini panic attack that someone's gonna misunderstand me or, misconstrue something I say, which has happened a couple of times. Quite famously with my Elemental Knights R video, I was making an observation. No one I had ever seen uses the Switch in handheld mode, and everyone kind of thought I was just giving them shit for it, which was never my intention, which I've said a few times. But my point with this is that, for everyone who makes fun of me for mispronouncing something, I think broad scale, I think I'm doing pretty okay, because despite the fact that this is, every time I record my voice giving me a mini heart attack, I think I'm doing okay. Just in all the strides I have to force myself to do in order to do the one thing that makes me happy in this world. Now that was just one aspect of sort of my developmental neurological stuff I've had to deal with. But more relevant to this particular video, and this game specifically, is that I've always had very poor fine motor control. And if you don't know what that is basically the individual control of the precise muscles in your hands. And I think part of the reason why I'm so bad at fighting games is because my hands are so bad. Like, I cannot put precise inputs in for special abilities or combo attacks or anything like that. Like, my hands just can't do that terribly well. So unless I'm playing something like BlazBlue that has the beginner mode where you hold down attacks to do specials, like, that stuff is very, very difficult for me. To give you an idea of just how bad my hands were growing up, and this is a very personal and embarrassing story of mine, but I physically could not tie my own shoes until I was almost in high school. That's how bad my hands were. And it wasn't through lack of knowing how to do it, and it wasn't, as my parents liked to constantly yell at me when I was younger for, just out of sheer laziness. No, I literally, despite spending a couple hours every day trying to learn how to do it, because I understood how important this was, just could not get my hands to do it properly. And even now, while I've been trying to do, like, exercises to give me at least a little bit more hand dexterity, my hands are still not that great compared to, an average person's. And I have to talk about all of this now because this game purely has mouse and keyboard control. I think I mentioned this in Shrine's Legacy, where I talked about I don't really get how people can use W, A, S, and D and stuff. And that wasn't a joke. That is literally that my brain has trouble handling stuff like that. The best way I can sort of analogize the experience I have versus someone else using W, A, S, and D would be sort of like the difference between playing the piano and trying to play the piano using ski gloves. Like, it just feels like your fingers are an inch bigger in basically every direction, so it's very easy to kind of get lost with where you are. When I was a kid, I'd play Flash games on the computer using the arrow keys, and that was a lot easier for me just because the arrow keys are in the middle of no man's land. You can put your 3 fingers on the arrows, and if you lose where you are, you still have the tactile input of 2 other fingers to sort of recorrect. That's easy for me. Whereas W, A, S, and D are a series of, at least on my computer, basically identical keys in a sea of entirely identical keys at touch. My keyboard does not have, like, indents or something. I really should invest in a keyboard with those or something, but this isn't something that can be fixed with key rebinds, because this game does have those. It should be a standard by now. I know it isn't, but it should be. This game does feature that, but that wouldn't help me because, again, it's more a problem with the physical keyboard than just where the keys are, because I have to keep track of W, A, S, D, E, R, Shift, C, and space on one hand. I get lost very, very easily unless I'm actively looking at my keyboard. I should say there kind of is a way to enable gamepad support in-game, but it's a little jank, and it's possibly even more awkward than anything. You can enable gamepads under mouse options. It doesn't ever actually handle mouse duties, which makes it kind of awkward. All it does is automatically enable the left stick to replace W, A, S, and D. Now, fortunately, you can then go into, like, the keyboard settings and rebind all the keys, but you still have to, like, manage the mouse as well as the control pad, so it's not ideal, and it's still arguably even worse to control for me. And it gets incredibly bad when you realize you have to also use, like, the mouse to aim for guns. So not having that relegated to a second stick, basically whatever gamepad setup you can work with this, almost unplayable. So yeah, controller accessibility options, not great. Also somewhat confusing to try and actually get to work. So if it looks like I'm running around playing very clumsily, it's because I am. I was constantly running around pressing, like, E to pick up items so that I could heal, only to find that I was mashing R to reload, like an absolute idiot. Yeah, keyboard controls are a bit tough for me, is the short version of this. I'm using a whole lot of words and revealing a lot of personal history, a lot of this channel's personal history, along my very, very personal history, some embarrassing stories, just to say, if this game looks like it plays clumsily, that's because of my stupid brain and my giant hands, and not because this game has any real control issues. And I didn't want that to be misrepresented in any way whatsoever, because I feel that's my responsibility to bring that to your attention. I guess you could, in a stretch, argue that this game doesn't have accessibility options. It doesn't have inherent controller support, which works better for me because the buttons are a bit better spaced out and the controller just fits in my giant hands a little better. I guess you could make that argument, But I just want to make clear that this game, if it looks like it controls bad, that's on me, and I apologize deeply, but it's not really something within my ability to do anything about. Short of using external mods, which I think is disingenuous to the base experience the game provides. It's less a problem with console games, but when I talk about PC games, the few times I have, if it looks stretched out or anything looks weird, that is not a matter of me messing with it on the back end. That is how it is natively playing, because I will not touch mods or anything, just by virtue that I want this game to be represented as it was represented to me in its default state. So like I said, I'm just really embarrassing myself and talking about very, very personal history of some of the struggles I've had over my life. Just to make it clear that this game does not control half as awkwardly as I make it look. That's entirely on me. And once again, I apologize, and thank you for your time. Anyway, on to the proper review. Zeno Clash is a game I actually have a little bit of experience with. See, about 10 years ago, Sony had been hacked, and I had gotten my credit card information stolen. Not that I'm still bitter about that, Sony, but once I got my credit card situation dealt with, I went with the first logical step you take in that situation, which is to buy an Xbox 360. And when I did so, the first thing I did with that was download demos for basically everything, because everything had demos back then. Can we go back to that? I liked when everything had demos. That was kind of nice. I mean, now Sony's store doesn't even have, like, pictures and videos of what I'm trying to buy, and how do I know if I want to buy it? Seriously, go back to demos. That was nice. But the thing is, I had downloaded so many things, and I played the demo to Zeno Clash, and it really hit a chord with me. I thought it was a very interesting and very special game. But I had downloaded so many different things that while it did resonate very deeply with me, and I remember it very fondly, I couldn't remember what the game was. That was a bit of a problem. You know, I checked my Steam notifications and I had a copy that had been gifted to me, and this has sort of been like a really nice little reunion for me. I get to finally properly experience the full game of that one quirky little demo I played way back in the day. And I gotta say, it didn't disappoint, for the most part. Now, Zeno Clash is a very interesting game. I think more than anything, the world it tries to set up is probably its key, most interesting feature when it comes to a narrative and a story type of thing. Its setting and mythos is clearly the highlight of it, I think. The story itself takes place mostly in medias res, starting off with the death of the father-mother. Your character Gat, the protagonist's father and mother, and it's a large avian creature that seems to have father/mothered a whole bunch of different species of creatures that are now your brothers and sisters, which, fun story, they're out to kill you. The first 60% of the game or so spends most of the time basically fleeing from your hometown and trying to find safety while sort of explaining how we got here. And then the latter third of it is heading back home and, you know, trying to fix things a little bit. As with all journeys, it's not so much the destination as it is the adventure we have along the way. And it's pretty interesting the sights you get to see on the planet of Xenozoic, which, as far as I can tell, is the end result of what appears to be some sort of bizarre drug hallucination and the developer's homeland of Chile. And honestly, it's pretty cool. And as you travel through this world trying to learn the backstory and what this big secret thing Gat had learned that had earned the ire of the father-mother and trying to murder him, you know, you get to see a whole bunch of interesting creatures and interesting locales that he experienced in his past and in his present as fleeing from the world. And kind of like I said at the start, I think the setting and the world this sets up is far more interesting than necessarily the plot itself. For example, one of the first areas you go to is the nearby forest, and this forest was where Gat was exiled after he left home, and there he spent a lot of time with the Corwids, which are a group of individuals who are basically crazy and focus their entire life along a very singular thing. In that sense, kind of like me. Although they take it way to the extreme. And it's usually in a very kind of gory, grim, brutal, or just kind of gross way. But they all have like their own unique thing they focus on. They never explain what Gats is, which is a little unfortunate, and I think kind of a failing of the story in a sense. Unless his focus was to murder father-mother, but he does mention a lot of interesting characters and what their primary goal in life was. Now, I'm not going to go over too many of them because, like I said, some of them are kind of grim and gross, but I want to focus on one because This one specific character is probably my favorite character in the game, and I'm not talking about this game unless I talk about him. So this is Oxameter. His whole thing is he wears a big ball on his head, but also his focus is that he walks in one straight line. He does not deviate from this. He does not stop. He must continue walking one straight line from basically his birth to his death. And he actually interrupts one of your fights to walk through the arena, like just completely unbothered by what you're doing. You know, you can't seem to interact with him or anything, but he just sort of walks through, and it's endearing to see this guy. And later on, you can see his path and where it leads, and it's equally heartwarming and heart-wrenching to see that. That this one character that I had a very brief, not even interaction with, just where his adventures took him. And it makes me kind of sad, but it also makes me want to see more stories about this guy. That's the kind of world this sets up, is just the smallest individuals and like the smallest little details in the setting make for like the biggest, most interesting things about this world and its story. The story itself, it's okay, but honestly I think the people in it are far more interesting than necessarily your adventure as Gat. Although it does have its high points, I will say that. The story itself is pretty good, but if nothing else, it's the setting that you absolutely want to get yourself immersed into. I absolutely love the world this game sets up. Now the gameplay to Zeno Clash is a first-person beat-em-up with some light first-person shooter elements. If I were to try and draw a comparison to some other game I've ever played, I can only think of one that did sort of this, and that would be this obscure original Xbox game called Breakdown. I actually have footage of that game, you can go watch that if you like. But it's a game that is primarily a beat 'em up. You take place in first person and you can punch your opponents. Occasionally you'll get different weapons, and then it sort of becomes a light first person shooter, but I will say the first person shooting is definitely on the weaker side of the gameplay scale here. The real focus is the punching and kicking and just the visceral melee carnage you can cause with your fists. And it does that very, very well. You have a series of different attacks with your fists. You have a basic punch with your left mouse button, and if you hold it down, you can do a little combo of punches. Honestly, I didn't see much use of this, at least on normal mode. Maybe on the harder difficulty, you'll get more use out of it. But honestly, the enemy can block these, and I relied more on the heavy punches because you get two types. You've got a standard heavy punch on the right mouse button, and a even stronger, heavier punch if you back up a little and then press the right mouse button. And if you hit them with a heavy attack, not only can you break their guard and damage them and potentially damage them more than a standard attack, you can leave them stunned. And if you approach them, you can kind of put them in sort of like a melee execution situation. Like, it's really, really brutal to do this, but when it happens, damn if it's not satisfying. Seriously, the punching and kicking and the blocking, the dodging, the strafing, it's a little bit awkward because it's all in first person. Like strafing and blocking specifically I had a little bit of issue with, but I have to admit the punching and just the damage dealing you can do with it, really, really nice. Also, you have a kick if you aim your mouse down and look at your feet, which is important for a few situations, but not as many as you'd think. And half the time I'm doing that, that's mostly because I'm trying to monitor my keys. As I mentioned, keyboard controls, not my specialty. You can also pick up little skull grenade mabobs, which can be used to disorient your enemies. Explosions in this game don't look very big, but they are significantly bigger than their actual visual animation appears. There was a couple times I got caught in my own explosion or thought I was away from like an enemy's explosion, and it just feels a little bit bigger than it is. It can be a little bit awkward trying to get around, especially in a first-person perspective where you don't have that wide a camera view. In addition to stuff like your grenades, you also can find weapons all over the world. These weapons are primarily guns, although there are a couple melee weapons, I'll talk about them, but the guns include a rifle, a pair of handguns, a crossbow that fires skulls at your enemies, that's a really, really fun one, as well as a sort of mortar grenade launcher shot. All of these guns take an intolerable amount of time to reload, and I feel like each one of these guns could carry twice as much ammo. The only weapon that holds more than 2 shots at a time are the handguns, and they do basically nothing. The bigger issue, however, is not necessarily the weapons themselves in terms of their ammo count or reloading or anything, so much as it is how they handle. Not in terms of aim or anything. The weapons themselves aim perfectly fine. The bigger issue is, however, that this is a beat 'em up at its core. So when you do get a weapon, the game likes to try and rush you with enemies. Typically an encounter with enemies is 3 to 4 enemies at a time. And the problem is, as long as you have a weapon in your hands, if an enemy hits you in any capacity, like even just a really weak glancing punch, your character's first thought is, I'm gonna throw my weapon across the room. Like, you just instantly drop every weapon ever. If you have a weapon in your hands, if you get touched, you drop it instantly. And that is more than a little frustrating. Because, like I said, the enemies like to have 3 or 4 enemies on screen at a time, because you can certainly target an enemy, and if you do that, they'll sort of take a sort of defensive, kind of getting behind cover kind of mentality to how they approach combat. But the others are basically just going to try and go around you and rush you to knock it out of your hands, which is strategically the intelligent thing to do, but to make these weapons feel potent or fun or worth using, it just makes it far more frustrating than anything. Although it does highlight one of the mechanics in this game, which is a heavy reliance on threat management. Unfortunately, it feels like these weapons never really get a chance to shine outside of like the very few shooting gallery segments this game sometimes throws at you. I will say, for the somewhat lackluster nature of the actual gunplay in this game, there is one really cool feature of the guns, and that's when the enemy is actually using them, because they'll actively call out before they try and fire at you. And if you get the opponent you're currently trying to punch in between the person with the gun and yourself, they will stop. They won't actively try and shoot their own teammates or anything, which means that there's a little bit more strategy to positioning and threat management in this game, and I definitely appreciate that. This game also features melee weapons, like I said. One of them is pretty special, and it's included with some special mechanics that I'll mention a bit later, but the other two are basically identical. You have a bone club, and you have what is effectively a cinder block tied to a stick. These weapons only show up in set specific areas in the game, and when you see them, that means you're fighting a big heavy guy, because these are the only things you can use against them. And these big heavy guys are kind of obnoxious. First of all, these weapons are very, very slow, so attacking big heavy guys that can do a lot of damage or knock you to the ground or knock the weapon out of your hand, not very fun. But in addition to the fact that you're now attacking very, very slowly, these enemies can create like basically all damage deflecting barriers that are significantly bigger than their character model. So it feels like you're trying to attack an enemy that has much longer reach than you, can pretty much knock you down whenever they want, and just decide to block any amount of damage ever, all while kind of nerfing you heavily with a heavy weapon. The big enemies are not very fun to fight. In fact, one of the worst moments in the game actually comes because of these. It's in the penultimate level, and you are forced into a very small area where you have to fight 2 at once. And like I said, their hitbox for their sort of damage deflecting barrier is bigger than them. So when you're fighting 2 at once, you kind of have 2 standing in front of you, one behind the other, and you're trying to attack the guy directly in front of you. The guy behind him will actually block all damage to him. In fact, this was one of the few times in the game where I actually died. It's not a very difficult game, but these guys are far more frustrating than they are fun to fight. And it's kind of sad I have to say that about these big guys, because they're one of the few examples of a different enemy type this game actually features. Your typical enemies either are standard humanoids, which there's a whole bunch of them, but they all more or less behave identically. You've got these big guys, which are more or less mini bosses or bosses of areas, and they all act basically identically, but they're just not very fun to fight. And then you've got a couple of basic wildlife creatures, and that's it, at least for the standard enemies. There's not a ton of different enemies to fight, and they don't use a lot of different strategies. It's entirely based on whether they're a big guy or a standard guy, and that's kind of your lot. If I did have one other complaint about this game, again, I think it goes back to the fact that I think this is kind of a budget game in some senses, and that is they reuse 2 bosses. And we're not even talking like the big brute guys that are just kind of obnoxious. They do reuse 2 different bosses twice each, which is a little bit boring. At least the second one they reuse, they kind of mix things up a little bit. But the first one, it's pretty much an identical fight. And that sounds pretty disappointing. You know, if the game hasn't sold you at this point, I totally get it. But, you know, there is a moment where this game truly does shine. About 60% of the way through the game, for 3 levels, the game kind of completely shifts tone. And it's in these 3 levels that I think this game shines at its greatest moments. Because for some reason they decide to take what is effectively a first-person beat-em-up and mix that with elements of a survival horror and Ikaruga of all things. Okay, I might need to explain this a little bit. So you make it to the end of the world, which is exactly what that sounds like, and you find what is effectively a crystal torch. This torch can then hold a type of magical light to it. You can't see how much light it contains, but every time you use it, it reduces its flame a little bit, sort of giving you an interesting, sort of somewhat esoteric visual indicator of how powerful this weapon is. And in this area, you fight only two things. These weird floaty jellyfish things that seem to have some kind of electric attack. I don't know, I killed them before they ever used anything. And these metallic like golem things that die instantly if you use the torch's flame attack. So to take out these enemies well, you need to manage how much energy you have in your flame. You really do have to sort of watch your resource consumption. It becomes a game of strategy more than anything else. But to balance this out and to make you want to play the game a little bit riskier, these enemies also attack with the same flame. And if you were to attack that flame with your torch, you suddenly get a full charge to it. So for these 3 levels, the game basically actively rewards you for trying to play as risky as possible by giving you the most destructive power it can, all while fighting these kind of really creepy, like metallic golem shadow monsters. And the level that follows the first one of these is like this huge, like gauntlet match where you're stuck in this huge arena and you just have to fight endless waves of them. It is very, very tense and very, very fun. I think these 3 levels are absolutely the high point of the game. The game itself is fine, you know, except for maybe like the big guys and the gunplay, because, you know, the beat 'em up elements kind of clash with the gunplay in general. But this game does feature a lot of really cool moments just in its setting. And those 3 levels, I'm not gonna lie, I would love to see an entire game just based around those 3 levels, because that is the basis for something really special right there. And this game's already got some pretty special moments. Also, this is a game that rewards you for kicking your opponent when they're down. Useful life lesson right there, seriously. I have to appreciate that this game lets you do that and rewards you for it. Overall, gameplay-wise, Zeno Clash is hard to explain. It's a first-person beat-em-up and a first-person shooter kind of all rolled into one. And while the first-person shooting doesn't feel particularly great because of how the enemies like to rush you, you know, the beat-em-up aspects of it are fun. The attacks feel very, very weighty and visceral, which is great, and it's just a great experience to run around beating things up with your fists. The game itself is not particularly difficult. In my entire playthrough, I died, I think, like 5 times, 3 of which were on those 2 really big guys in the penultimate level, and the last 2 times were on the final boss, which is a little bit tricky. It's also worth noting, if you are the kind of person who values a long game above all else, this game will probably not appeal to you, because the fact is, with all my problems with the controls, as well as the fact that I died, you know, half a dozen times or so, I still beat this game in about 2.5 hours. It's not a very big game at all. It has 19 chapters, and some chapters are about as long as a single fight. Not super long, but I will say that if you do skip out on this because this game is so short, I would say that you are missing out on a pretty unique little game. Now, the overall presentation to Zeno Clash is pretty tremendous. I don't think this is necessarily the most high-budget experience I've ever played, certainly. Like I said, Oxander is such a great character, but the fact is, he's a character that just sort of shuffles in one direction, and there's no real character interaction with him. I think literally his existence is to try and create a character with a limited budget for animation, and I think that could kind of be a way to describe a lot of things in this game. Not necessarily everything is all that well animated, but it works for what it needs to do. I did notice one visual bug that kind of made it a little bit disorienting to play, and again, it has to do with those really, really big brute enemies. When they knock you down, there's an animation of your character getting knocked to the ground, having to stand himself up. That's fine, but at least every time I got knocked down by the brute enemies, after I got up, it would then replay that animation. I wouldn't take any extra damage or anything, but it just felt weird and kind of disorienting, on top of already being somewhat disoriented, and, you know, then having to go and find my weapon that I've dropped. That wasn't ideal. But the world is filled with weird, wonderful creatures, weird, wonderful inhabitants. Seriously, I love the bizarre people in the woods that have like their own singular life focus that they devote every waking moment to. These characters are really neat. I love how bizarrely alien and animalistic some of these characters are by design. It's very, very cool. And the environments themselves are really kind of a surrealist landscape in a lot of cases, especially the end of the world stuff. the environments are great. Now, the game's sound design is tremendous in a lot of respects. I think the soundtrack itself is passable. I don't remember really all that much of it offhand, but it worked in the moment for what it needed to do. And the voice acting is pretty hit or miss, honestly. I think it's okay, but it could be a lot better. That said, what really stood out to me was the Foley work. Because this is a game where you are breaking bones and, punching people in the face, firing guns. You gotta make that stuff sound impactful, or it's gonna be, worthless. The guns and, the punching could be the most powerful thing ever, but if it doesn't sound like it, you're not gonna convey that feeling to your player. And if you can't convey that feeling to your player, well, then it's not gonna feel half as good to play, no matter how powerful your weapons are. Fortunately, crunching bones with your fists is amazing. Firing guns, they all feel very, very powerful. Even the little, dual-wieldy handguns that are particularly weak, they still sound pretty impactful. The explosions are rather nice, but I want to single out one small singular moment in this game, and it's not even like a big bombastic moment or anything. There's this moment in this one stage where you're walking around this city street, and there's this deformed guy who walks in front of you. He's dragging a cup on the ground, and as he walks, he drags it across a metal grate in the ground that leads to the sewers, and that cup hits every single little bar of that grate. And every single one of those bars made a sound. Someone created some pretty complex interaction and Foley work for that, and I am thoroughly impressed. It might not be a big standout moment in the game or anything, but the fact they went to that much effort really stood out to me. I can definitely see a lot of effort and passion in this game, and it shows through. I think overall presentation-wise, this game is pretty solid. Sure, the soundtrack could be a little bit better, sure, the voice acting is a little hit or miss, but overall I think it is excellent, and the visuals make me definitely want to explore this world a whole lot more. Now, if you want a copy of Zeno Clash on the PC, well, it is currently available for about $11 on Steam. Now, like I said, if you like a long game, this might not appeal to you, and I would suggest at least waiting for a sale, because I think this game really deserves as much attention as it should get, because while it's not perfect by any means, it is certainly something special. The gameplay itself is a lot of fun, and the world it sets up and the environments and, the interactions with the world and the people in it are very memorable. I'm not going to forget this game anytime soon, I'll tell you that much. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you once again to Sly Boots for the hookup, there for all my Steam game needs, it seems. This game was a fun little reunion for me. I had played this originally on the Xbox 360 through a demo, and while I couldn't remember the name of this game, 10 years later, I still remembered my experience with it. And damn if the wait wasn't worth it. Sure, it's got some issues, and sure, it could be a little bit better in some respects, but I think this game is really damn special, and I know it got a sequel, and I'm gonna have to play that sometime soon, because this game is absolutely worth your attention if you like beat-em-ups. Because while it might have issues, this game really is something special. I cannot think of anything quite entirely like this. I can't think of a world in a game quite like this. And I think that you'd be doing yourself a disservice not to experience Zeno Clash. Okay, and look, if I haven't sold you on this game already, let me try one more time. This is a game where you can fight a blind sniper on top of a brontosaurus that throws exploding squirrels at you. That get your attention?